They don't leave when the damage happens. They leave when they finally understand it. And by the time you notice their absence, the decision was made long before you felt the silence. If this is making you see someone or yourself differently, take a moment to like this and subscribe, because understanding these hidden patterns changes the way you see every relationship from this point forward. Emotional exhaustion in an empath does not arrive suddenly. It builds in layers that are almost invisible from the outside. At first, it feels like purpose. They give attention, they listen deeply, they adjust their own emotional state to stabilize others, and this creates a sense of meaning. Over time, however, that constant outward focus begins to drain internal reserves. Unlike most people, an empath is not only responding to what is said, but also to what is felt, implied, or suppressed, which means their nervous system is continuously processing more information than is openly visible. This creates a silent overload that rarely gets acknowledged. What makes this exhaustion particularly complex is that empaths tend to normalize it. They tell themselves that this is simply what connection requires, that understanding others is part of who they are, and that stepping back would feel like a failure of compassion. Because of this, they often ignore early signs of depletion such as irritability, mental fog, or a subtle sense of emotional heaviness. Instead of withdrawing, they try to give more, believing that more effort will restore balance. But this only accelerates the depletion. As the imbalance grows, a shift begins internally. The same interactions that once felt meaningful start to feel draining. Conversations require more effort. Emotional responsiveness becomes delayed. There is a quiet recognition forming beneath the surface that something is no longer sustainable. This is not resentment in the usual sense. It is a deeper awareness that their energy is being spent without renewal. The empath begins to feel disconnected not because they care less, but because they have reached the limits of what they can carry. Eventually, the body and mind enforce what the empath has resisted. The capacity to engage diminishes sharply, and what once felt like choice becomes necessity. At this stage, withdrawal is not dramatic or confrontational. It is often silent and firm, driven by an internal need to recover balance that has been neglected for too long. When an empath realizes they are the only one sustaining emotional depth in a relationship, the awareness does not strike all at once. It unfolds gradually through observation. In the beginning, they assume mutuality. They believe the care they offer is being mirrored in ways that may simply be less visible. So they continue to invest, listening closely, responding thoughtfully, and adjusting themselves to maintain harmony. But over time, subtle discrepancies begin to surface. They notice that their effort to understand is rarely reciprocated, that their emotional presence is expected but not returned, and that the connection depends heavily on their ability to keep it alive. This realization is not built on a single moment of disappointment, but on repeated experiences where depth meets limitation. The empath begins to see that conversations remain on the surface unless they are the one guiding them deeper. Vulnerability feels one-sided. When they express something meaningful, it may be acknowledged but not truly engaged with. There is a difference between being heard and being understood, and empaths are acutely sensitive to that difference. Slowly, they recognize that what they are offering is not being met with the same level of emotional awareness. What intensifies this process is their tendency to give the benefit of the doubt. They may rationalize the imbalance, telling themselves the other person expresses care differently or is simply less expressive. This delays the clarity of the situation. However, patterns are difficult for an empath to ignore indefinitely. They begin to notice that their role has become structural rather than shared. They are the ones holding the emotional framework of the relationship together, ensuring communication flows, resolving tension, and maintaining connection. As this awareness deepens, something shifts internally. The meaning they once attached to the relationship starts to erode because it no longer feels authentic. Connection without reciprocity begins to feel hollow, regardless of how much history or attachment exists. The empath does not necessarily become angry. Instead, they become clear. And that clarity changes how they engage. Their energy withdraws, not as a reaction, but as a natural response to imbalance that can no longer be justified internally. Repeated micro-betrayals are rarely recognized as betrayals in the moment, which is precisely why they are so powerful in shaping an empath's eventual withdrawal. These are not dramatic events or obvious acts of disloyalty. They appear as small inconsistencies, slight distortions of truth, moments where intention and action do not fully align. A promise that is casually broken, a feeling that is acknowledged but not respected, a pattern of behavior that contradicts earlier reassurance. Individually, each instance is easy to dismiss. But for an empath, nothing exists in isolation. Everything is part of a pattern they are constantly reading beneath the surface. At first, the empath tends to interpret these moments generously. They assume misunderstanding, stress, or human imperfection. Their natural inclination is to preserve meaning in the relationship rather than dismantle it. This means they often absorb the discomfort rather than confront it directly. However, emotional memory accumulates quietly. Even when they do not verbally address these inconsistencies, they register internally as deviations from trust. The empath's perception is not just cognitive, it is emotional and intuitive, so what is small externally can feel significant internally. Over time, the repetition of these small fractures creates a slow erosion of certainty. The empath begins to notice that words are not reliably supported by behavior, that emotional signals fluctuate in unpredictable ways, and that reassurance often needs to be re-earned rather than naturally sustained. This creates internal tension because empaths rely heavily on coherence between what is said and what is felt. When that coherence weakens, trust does not collapse immediately, it becomes unstable. What makes this process particularly profound is that empaths rarely confront it through confrontation alone. Instead, they observe, they compare, they reflect. And in that quiet analysis, patterns become undeniable. Once a threshold is reached where inconsistency outweighs reliability, something fundamental shifts in their perception of safety within the relationship. At that point, the relationship is no longer experienced as secure ground. It becomes mentally and emotionally costly to remain engaged in something that requires constant interpretation to maintain trust. The withdrawal that follows is not impulsive. It is the outcome of accumulated clarity that has finally crossed the point where staying no longer feels coherent with their internal sense of truth. An empath's inner world operates as a constantly adjusting system of perception where emotional signals, environmental tension, and relational dynamics are processed beneath conscious awareness. When something within that system begins to feel misaligned, they do not immediately react outwardly. Instead, they turn inward. This inward shift is not withdrawal in the social sense at first. It is a form of recalibration where attention is redirected from external engagement to internal coherence. They start evaluating how they feel in relation to what they are experiencing and whether the emotional environment they are in supports or disrupts their internal equilibrium. This process often begins subtly. Situations that once felt natural begin to feel slightly off. Conversations may still function normally, but the emotional resonance behind them feels diminished. The empath starts to notice a lack of alignment between their internal state and the external interaction. Rather than dismissing this feeling, they sit with it. This sitting with discomfort is where the real shift begins. They are not trying to escape the situation, they are trying to understand why it feels different. As this internal observation deepens, the empath begins to reevaluate connections through a quieter lens. They are less influenced by surface-level consistency and more attuned to emotional authenticity. If something repeatedly creates internal tension, confusion, fatigue, or emotional dissonance, their system begins to categorize it as unsustainable. This is not a logical decision made in isolation. It is a felt recognition that something in the relational field is no longer supporting their stability. During this phase, external behavior may appear unchanged for a time, which creates the illusion that everything is still intact. But internally, the structure is shifting. The empath begins to reduce emotional investment gradually, not as punishment, but as a natural response to restoring balance. They stop extending themselves in the same way, not because they are trying to distance, but because their system is prioritizing internal clarity over external maintenance. This realignment is quiet, almost invisible from the outside, yet it is decisive. By the time others notice a change, the empath has already undergone an internal restructuring where certain connections no longer hold the same emotional weight they once did, and continuing in the same way would require ignoring what they now clearly feel to be true. This reason is the most misunderstood because it is often mistaken for emotional withdrawal or detachment from care, when in reality it is the moment an empath stops abandoning themselves in order to maintain a bond. For a long time, they are willing to stretch their emotional boundaries in ways that prioritize understanding, harmony, and connection over personal comfort. They tolerate imbalance, they absorb emotional tension, and they adapt themselves to keep relationships functioning even when reciprocity is unclear. This creates a pattern where their own needs gradually move into the background of the relationship dynamic. However, there comes a point where internal awareness becomes too strong to ignore. It is not a sudden emotional reaction, but a quiet recognition that their continued presence in a situation requires self-neglect. They begin to see that staying emotionally available in the same way means consistently overriding their own signals of discomfort, fatigue, or misalignment. This realization does not feel dramatic, it feels clarifying. It shifts the focus from, how can I maintain this connection, to, what am I losing by maintaining it in this way? Once this awareness stabilizes, their behavior starts to change. They no longer automatically respond to emotional demands with the same immediacy or depth. They begin to observe rather than absorb. There is a subtle but profound shift from external orientation to internal prioritization. This is not driven by resentment or rejection of others, but by the recognition that their emotional system cannot remain healthy if it continues to operate in a one-sided way. What makes this stage irreversible is that it is rooted in self-respect rather than reaction. The empath is no longer negotiating their worth through the relationship. Instead, they are evaluating whether the relationship allows them to remain aligned with themselves. When the answer is consistently no, disengagement becomes a natural extension of that truth. From the outside, this can look like sudden disappearance, but internally, it is the result of a slow, recentering process where the empath finally stops treating their own emotional needs as secondary. Once that shift happens, returning to the old pattern no longer feels possible, not because they stopped caring, but because they started including themselves in the equation with equal importance. This stage is often misunderstood because it appears like emptiness or emotional shutdown, when in reality it is an internal processing phase where the empath is reorganizing meaning, memory, and emotional association. After prolonged periods of emotional overload or imbalance, their system does not simply switch off, it recalibrates. Silence becomes a space where input is reduced so that internal clarity can form without interference. From the outside, this looks like distance, but internally it is highly active reflection. During this phase, the empath is not engaging in outward emotional exchange because their attention has shifted inward to decode what has been experienced. They revisit patterns, interactions, and subtle emotional signals that were previously absorbed in real time. What once felt like a continuous flow of connection is now being broken down into components. What felt authentic, what felt forced, what felt reciprocal, and what felt draining. This is not overthinking in a chaotic sense, but a structured form of emotional sorting that allows them to understand what their experience actually meant. At the same time, their nervous system is attempting to restore equilibrium. After prolonged exposure to emotional intensity, sensitivity, and relational demand, the empath requires a reduction in external stimulation. Silence provides that reduction. It is not avoidance of people as much as it is withdrawal from emotional noise. In this state, even normal interactions can feel overwhelming, not because they lack value, but because the internal system is still recalibrating its threshold for engagement. This phase also serves as a boundary formation process. Without consciously deciding it, the empath begins to define what feels acceptable moving forward and what no longer aligns with their internal state. These boundaries are not announced, they emerge naturally through reduced responsiveness and selective engagement. The silence itself becomes the boundary. To those observing from the outside, this can feel sudden because the processing happens internally before any external change becomes visible. By the time the absence is noticed, the empath has already gone through an extensive internal reorganization that redefines how, when, and whether they will re-engage in the same emotional patterns again, making the silence not an end, but a transition into a different form of awareness and self-protection. This realization does not happen as a dramatic decision or emotional rebellion. It forms gradually through repeated internal comparison between what a connection promises and what it actually delivers in lived experience. Empaths are not primarily driven by surface-level attraction or convenience. They are oriented toward emotional authenticity. So when a relationship repeatedly fails to reflect that authenticity, when understanding feels partial, presence feels uneven, or emotional truth feels compromised, they begin to register a deeper form of incompatibility that words alone cannot resolve. At first, they often attempt to preserve the connection by adapting themselves. They may communicate more clearly, give more space, or try to understand the other person's limitations in order to maintain harmony. But over time, this adaptive effort reveals something important. No amount of adjustment can replace mutual emotional presence. The empath starts to notice that even when conflict is absent, something essential is still missing. The connection functions, but it does not nourish. This is where detachment begins to form internally. It is not rejection of the other person as an individual, but recognition that the relationship no longer aligns with their emotional truth. Empaths experience authenticity as a core requirement, not a preference. When authenticity collapses, the emotional bond begins to lose structural integrity. They may still show up physically or continue interacting normally for a period, but internally, the emotional investment is already receding. What makes this stage significant is that it is not based on anger or disappointment in a reactive sense. It is based on clarity. The empath begins to understand that staying connected in the same way requires ignoring their own internal signals repeatedly. And once they recognize that pattern, the cost of maintaining the connection becomes too high. They are no longer asking whether the relationship can be repaired. They are asking whether it is still honest for them to remain in it. The eventual disappearance is simply the external expression of that internal conclusion. It is not a sudden departure from care, but the final alignment between inner truth and outer behavior, where remaining present would require self-denial that they are no longer willing to sustain. What appears sudden is almost never sudden in reality. By the time an empath reaches visible detachment, the internal process has already passed through many quiet stages that others do not witness. From the outside, the shift feels abrupt because empaths rarely announce their emotional transitions. They do not always argue, explain, or signal the exact moment something changes. Instead, they observe, absorb, and process internally until a threshold is reached where continuation no longer feels coherent with their inner state. This final stage is the accumulation point of everything that came before it: emotional exhaustion, imbalance, micro-betrayals, internal realignment, and the decision to stop self-abandonment. Each of these layers contributes to a gradual withdrawal of emotional investment long before physical or communicative absence becomes noticeable. What others interpret as disappearance is actually the last visible outcome of an invisible internal restructuring that has already completed its course. During this phase, the empath has already reduced emotional access long before they reduce physical presence. They are no longer engaging from the same depth, no longer interpreting interactions with the same openness, and no longer extending emotional energy in the way they once did. The connection still exists externally, but internally it has already been reclassified as something that no longer requires the same level of investment. This creates a delay between internal decision and external recognition. When the final withdrawal happens, it often feels clean and quiet. There is rarely a dramatic confrontation or explanation that fully captures the depth of the shift. This is because the empath has already processed the reasoning internally multiple times before taking any visible action. By the time others notice absence, the empath has already passed through acceptance, detachment, and internal closure. What remains afterward is silence, but that silence is not emptiness. It is completion. It is the point where emotional energy is no longer split between staying and leaving. From the outside, it looks like disappearance without warning. From the inside, it is simply the final alignment between what was felt for a long time and what could no longer be sustained in action, leaving behind a presence that had already begun fading long before it was ever noticed as gone.